the Headwaters Resource Conservation and Development Council presents the Great Lakes Restoration Initiative. In partnership with the United States Department of Agriculture, Natural Resources Conservation Service, the United States Environmental Protection Agency, the Foundation for Pennsylvania Watersheds, the Pennsylvania Grazing Lands Coalition, Penn State College of Agricultural Sciences, Penn State Extension, the Potter County Conservation District, and by the Pennsylvania Department of Conservation and Natural Resources, Bureau of Forestry. Thank you for your support.
Here is the equation we use to estimate pasture size in acres. On the top part of the equation, called the numerator, we have days, animal numbers, animal weights, percent intake. On the bottom, in the denominator, we start to look at the forage and talk about pounds per inch per acre times inches times percent utilization. Now I'm going to talk about each one of these factors and how they play into the equation. In the top, days. This is how much time the livestock will spend on a particular pasture. This may be 1 day for a dairy cow, maybe up to 7 days for a beef or sheep herd. But what you will find, the shorter time you spend on pasture, the more efficient and the better results you will see. Next is animal numbers. This is your animal numbers, so estimate 10, put in 10. Animal weight, again, we're estimating weight. So we want the average weight of the herd that's going to be grazing. Percent intake. Percent intake varies based on your livestock species. Lactating cows range between 2 and 4%. The range is because it depends on how much barn feeding you're doing. The more barn feeding you're doing, the less pasture the cows will eat. Dry cows about 1.9%, dairy heifers about 2.3%, beef cows 2.5%, ewes 1.8 to 4, and again that depends on the stage of lactation. Horses around 2, goats 1.8 to 5%, again depending on the stage of lactation. This is intake is percent of body weight. On the bottom side of the equation, we talk about pounds per inch per acre in inches. For this part, we're going to use the grazing stick, which I will cover in a minute. This slide depicts how much forage is available in pounds per acre inch based on density and the forage type. On the left-hand side, you'll see different forage types listed, such as bluegrass and clover. On the top, you'll see 0 to 1 dots, 1 to 2, or 3 plus. This refers to the density of forage in the pasture, and we use the grazing stick to estimate how many dots or the density of the forage, which I will get to in a minute. But let's just say that we had a bluegrass clover pasture and we saw 2 dots. That means we have about 300 pounds of forage per inch per acre. Today we are here in Potter County on Mike Thompson's farm to talk about pasture allocation using the grazing stick. This particular stick was developed for Pennsylvania specifically in the grasses we have here in Pennsylvania. It has 4 sides. The first side is simply a yardstick to measure grass height. The second side talks about tall grass pastures such as orchard grass, reed canary grass, and tall fescue. The third side talks about bluegrass clover pastures, which we typically see in a horse or pasture situation or a sheep situation. And finally, we have warm season grasses on the final side of the stick. Let's talk about some of the markings on the grazing stick. And for this example, we're going to use the tall grass pastures. You notice we have a mark down here comes up to about 4 inches, and that's when we want to remove the cattle or livestock from the pasture. We want to remove them until the grass grows up to 10-12 inches tall for enough regrowth for grazing. What's the reasoning behind leaving the residual? The way grass makes its energy is through photosynthesis, and to do that we need to collect sunlight. So we need a 4-inch or greater blade up from the pasture sward to collect sunlight to make energy. What happens when we graze closer than that is we start to lose our species composition. We'll start to see more of a shift to a bluegrass clover pasture. And the reason for that is bluegrass clover can tolerate a closer grazing than tall grass pastures because they don't store carbohydrates as high in the stem. Now let's talk about dry matter production in a pasture. That depends on 2 factors. Number 1, the density of the sward, or how thick it is, and the grass height. Let's first discuss the thickness of the grass. What we have here in front of me is a little grid we take and slide into the pasture when it's a proper grazing height. Then we try to look down and count the little dots. You want to take and slide the pasture stick into the grazing sward. Get over top of it, look straight down, and try to count the number of dots you see in the grid. The more dots you see, the less dense the forage. Once we have identified how many dots we have in our grass system, we want to identify the forage species. For example, if we had an orchard grass stand with 1 dot, we'd have about 300 pounds of forage per acre inch. Now let's talk about measuring grass height. You want to do this very carefully because incorrect numbers can lead to incorrect estimation of dry matter on pasture. You want to go out and measure the average heights of the grass. You don't want to take and stretch the blades upward. That will not give you a true reading. So in this case, I'd estimate we have about 8 inches of available forage for the livestock. The method we just discussed is a good tool to use to estimate pasture allocation in a pasture system for a rotational grazing system. It's a basic, simple formula. It's a good place to start when estimating pasture sizes. Once you gain experience and become a better grazer, or even a mod grazer or an adaptive grazer, you can use your experience to do this without using the stick in the pasture allocation equation. We now have an estimate in pounds per acre inch, and we talked about measuring inches. So the next part of the equation is percent utilization. Percent utilization varies based on rotation times. This slide shows the estimated utilization rates based on the days on a particular pasture. For 1-day rotation, it's about 80%, down to a 6-day rotation, which is about 60%. Now I'd like to discuss rest periods. Rest periods is the amount of time it takes the forage to regrow from the grazing height back up to its starting height. And again, that depends on your forage species, and we discussed that. We talked about the grazing stick a few minutes earlier. Season and also weather conditions will play a role in rest periods. In the spring, with cool, moist conditions, we usually have very fast regrowth, and our rest period can be as little as 10 to 14 days. If you get to the summer like we had this year, we get hot, we get dry, we get very slow regrowth. It can be as many as 40 to 60 days. Rest period comes into play when we start trying to estimate the total number of paddocks for a particular point in time. The number of paddocks needed depends on your rest period in days, divided by your rotation time in days, plus 1. The plus 1 is added because the herd has to be grazing somewhere while all the other paddocks are resting. So now we know how many paddocks we need. We can determine the number of acres. Total number of acres needed is basically the paddock size times the number of paddocks. So to use what we just learned, let's do an example. A farm with 20 beef cows, averaging 1,000 pounds of body weight, on bluegrass clover pasture, 6 inches tall, with a fair stand, 2 dots. The cows are on a 3-day rotation. How big should the paddock be for this herd? How many paddocks and total acres are needed for a 30-day rest period? So plugging our numbers into our simple equation, the number of acres needed equals a 3-day rotation times 20 cows times an average body weight of 1,000 pounds. From an earlier slide, beef cattle eat about 2.5% of the body weight per day. On the denominator side of the equation, Based on our chart, either from a previous slide or off the stick, we have about 300 pounds per inch per acre of forage based on the 2 dots and the bluegrass clover pasture. We measured 4 inches of available forage, and from a previous slide, utilization is 75% on a 3-day rotation. So running the numbers, we need about 1.7 acres for those 20 cows to graze for 3 days. To determine the number of paddocks needed for the 30-day rest period, it's simply 30 days divided by our 3-day rotation plus 1 equals 11 paddocks. Total number of acres equals 11 paddocks times 1.7 acres, or about 18.7 acres total acres needed for this herd.